Welcome. This is Effective Altruism for Christians, a guest speaker event with Brian Greene. And the topic today is existential risk. Brian Greene is Director of Technology Ethics at Markkula Center of Ethics. And well, without further ado, we'll start sharing the slides. And Brian, I will give you the floor.
All right, thank you. First of all, thank you so much for inviting me to be with you here today. This is a topic that I've been working on for a long time. It's probably because I grew up as a child in the 1980s, back when nuclear war was something that people thought about a lot. So, it's kind of shaped my perspective on reality. And it's an interesting question when it comes to Christianity also. Once again, as Vesa was saying, I'm the Director of Technology Ethics at the Markkula Center for Applied Ethics at Santa Clara University. And I'll tell you a little bit more about my background in the next couple slides. So let's go on to the next one. All right, so this is a basic outline. Just a show of hands, how many people saw my talk at the EA for Christians conference back in April? All right, looks like a couple people did. All right, so I was going to go, if a lot of people had seen it, then I would have gone faster through the first part. Some of this will be duplicate material, but the stuff later on will be new things. So I'm going to talk about background, what the threat is, and then what to do about it. Next slide, please. All right, so like I was just saying, this talk's an expansion of what I talked about back in April. And so I'll move relatively fast. Next slide, please. All right, so background on me. I was raised nominally Catholic, but I was actually more of an atheist or an anti-theist all through high school. I went to University of California, Davis, which is a place which is kind of renowned for genetics and biology and agriculture. It's an agricultural school. Let's see, Vesa, I'm seeing a little slide off to the side of the screen over there on the left. There we go. Now you got it. Thank you. And so I started studying genetics and biotechnology, and I always thought I was going to be a scientist when I grew up. And then I discovered I hated laboratory work. Molecular biology laboratory work was not something that I enjoyed. And so I had to figure out something else to do with my life. At the meantime, I ended up getting converted by evangelicals. And in the United States, I don't know if this is the way it is in Europe or in other parts of the world. In the United States, there's a very strong depiction of Christians in the media as being not smart. And so since I decided I was a smart person, we can talk about the vice of pride perhaps being involved with that. I decided that I couldn't be a Christian until I met smart Christians and realized that this cultural milieu that I was in was not correct. It had been lying to me. And so I decided if I was going to be a Christian, I was going to be one who actually did something about it. So I joined the Jesuit Volunteer Corps and went overseas. Next slide, please. I went to the Marshall Islands. The Marshall Islands are out in the middle of the Pacific Ocean. They are very, very far out there. The Pacific Ocean is a big ocean. It's, let's see, it covers, I think, about 9,000 square miles or 9,000 miles across if you go from California towards Australia. So it's very, very large. They're way out in the middle of it. They're not close to anything. And this made them a place where the United States wanted to do nuclear testing because of the remoteness of it. Next slide, please. So I lived on an island called Ebi. Ebi is 80 acres. It's a very small island, and it has about 12,000 or 15,000 people on it. So it has a lot of people in a very small area. Why is this? It's because the United States decided that the entire population of the atoll should be put on this one island so that the rest of it could become a US military base. Next slide, please. This is my classroom. My classroom was on a nearby island that you could drive to on a causeway. So you can see me there. Next slide, please. And what happens if your islands are really remote and the United States has just captured you after inventing nuclear weapons? They use your islands for nuclear weapons testing. So here's one of the largest nuclear tests, or actually the largest nuclear test the United States ever conducted. This is the Castle Bravo test, which was a disaster, to put it mildly. The test ended up being about twice or 2.5 times as large as it was supposed to be. The yield was much larger than expected because the United States was using stolen Soviet technology. So just like the Soviets stole a bunch of technology from the United States. The United States did the same thing to the Soviet Union and ended up boosting their yield higher than they expected because of an unexpected reaction with the lithium in the internal parts of the bomb. Long technical story, we don't need to get into it. Next slide, please. The United States is still using the Marshall Islands for nuclear testing. However, it's not for bomb testing. It is for ballistic missiles and ballistic missile interceptor testing. So these are pictures of missiles being launched from the island that was a few miles north of where my high school was. And so every once in a while, my class would be interrupted by large rumbling noises, which were the sounds of rockets being fired. Next slide, please. And of course, the United States also shoots ballistic missiles from California to the Marshall Islands. This is the reentry of a Minuteman III. I didn't take this picture, but I saw this happen when I was out there. And I went out in the street one night knowing that there was supposed to be a ballistic missile reentry, and I saw it. And I have to tell you, it's an impressive sight to see these meteors coming right at you. And of course, they're not meteors. Later on, I met a woman who used to design nuclear weapons because the Bay Area has a laboratory, the Lawrence Livermore Laboratory, which is a bomb laboratory, fundamentally. And I said, yeah, I was in the Marshall Islands and I saw Minuteman III, the 3 warheads re-enter the atmosphere. And I thought to myself, yeah, if those were real, I'd be dead next thing. And she said, that's right. And I thought to myself, wow, she's very confident in the ability for weapons to kill people. Next slide, please. Now, the Marshall Islands not only have been used for nuclear weapons testing and for missile testing of various sorts, they're also going underwater from climate change. They're very flat islands. And so as the sea level rises, and the sea level has already gone up about 8 inches, it's probably getting closer to 9 inches now, since I've been using that statistic for a few years, and the sea level goes up around 2 to 3 millimeters every year. This inexorable rise is going to put their country underwater, and their entire country will cease to have land in it. This is a very significant thing when you think about it. Humans are changing the composition of the atmosphere, which is changing the temperature of the Earth, which is causing ice to melt, which is causing ice to flow into the ocean, which is raising the sea level, and is going to destroy 4 countries in the world. It's going to destroy the Marshall Islands. It's going to destroy Tuvalu. It's going to destroy Kiribati, and it's going to destroy the Maldives. They're all low-lying island countries. And of course, other countries are going to be heavily damaged as well, for example, Bangladesh. But this is something new in history that we should think about in terms of human power, that we now have the ability within our grasp, within our own realm of action, to cause very, very significant disasters. Something that, this used to be the kind of stuff that Poseidon would do, right? Or that Zeus or some, ancient god would be doing, but instead humans are doing it now. Next slide, please. So I like to talk about the Marshall Islands as if they are a canary in a coal mine, right? Which is that you take the canary into the coal mine. If the gases down there get too bad, then of course the canary dies first. And that way the humans can all run away because they know they hit a pocket of poisonous gas. Now the Marshall Islands are going to be similar. They're going to be one of the first places to be heavily damaged or destroyed by rising sea levels. That does not mean that they will be the last. They're just the first people. Everybody else follows behind that. Next slide, please. So while I was out there, all these things were kind of bouncing around inside my head, and I thought to myself, I need to do something. God, make me do your work. That was what I prayed over and over again. I knew I was lazy, right? This is kind of a fundamental problem, which is that I knew that I wasn't going to make some sort of impact on the world unless I actually made it my job. And so I needed God to push me along like that. So I prayed. And then I didn't realize exactly what that was going to be. So I knew that teaching was fun. I really enjoyed teaching out there. And then I kind of had these ideas bouncing around in my head. Technology is really very powerful, and we ought to do something to make sure that it's being controlled in an ethical manner and not being used for destruction. So I applied for a master's degree and then a doctoral degree at the Graduate Theological Union in Berkeley. My dissertation was on technology and human nature. And one of the things that I have there sometimes, oh, sorry, go back one slide. Sometimes God pushes us to our limits because he has greater faith in us than we have in ourselves. I think that, that's kind of a fundamental thing that I realized out there, which is that a lot of times we talk about having faith in God, we really need to talk about God having faith in us, because we can really, really ruin the planet, right? We can make things really, really bad, and yet God somehow has faith that we're going to pull through. I think we should take God's confidence in us and think about that as well, because I think it should really motivate us to recognize that we have a lot of potential here, and we really need to be capturing that. Next slide, please. All right, so I finished my dissertation. I defended my dissertation in January of 2013. And the very next week, I started at the Markkula Center for Applied Ethics at Santa Clara University. This is a picture of our campus. I started as the assistant director of campus ethics, but I was teaching in the engineering school at the same time. So eventually they said, hey, Brian, we got a lot of questions having to do with technology. We're going to make a job for you having to do with technology. So now this is my full-time job. And I've been publishing on existential risk, among other things. Any questions so far? Anybody, anything that people want to talk about? All right. I'm quite capable of monologuing for very long periods of time, so feel free to do things that stop me from doing that.
I just remind you too that there's a Slido
Right.
that I posted a link to in the chat. I would repost it when we continue. If you're too shy, you don't want your face or your voice on the video recording, you can submit a question via Slido.
Thank you. Next slide, please. So what is existential risk? An existential risk, or Xrisk, is a risk that threatens human extinction. Right below that level is a global catastrophic risk. It's a risk that threatens to devastate large areas of the Earth's surface or kill large numbers of people, possibly destroying civilization, although not causing extinction. I had good advice when I was writing my dissertation. One of my professors said, always start with the deeper problem. And by doing that, you can really get into fundamental subject matter, which was something that I've always found to be good advice. I don't think Christians have any problem with recognizing that we ought to stop global catastrophic risk. That's obvious. The existential risk question is a bit different because it's kind of a qualitatively different question, which is why I think, why I'm talking about it here, just because it's a little bit of a different question. All right, next slide, please. So when Nick Bostrom came up with this schematic of what existential risk is and a global catastrophic risk, this was, I think it's a useful kind of diagram to show what these things are. And you can debate what's in the different boxes, but I think the fundamental idea is that global catastrophic risks are big and they're bad, and existential risks are the biggest and the worst that we can think of, at least in terms of material reality. Next slide, please. So what are some examples? There are a bunch of natural risks. For example, asteroid impacts, supervolcanoes, natural pandemics, gamma ray bursts. Gamma ray bursts are very, very rare. Nearby supernova, expansion of the sun, things like that. The expansion of the sun, of course, is inevitable, but it's a very, very slow process. And there's not much we can do about it unless we want to somehow move the Earth out of the way or get off of the Earth. The anthropogenic, all of the natural risks, I'll say, all the natural risks are pretty slow. And they're fairly rare. That's I guess what I should really say, right? They're not necessarily slow, they just don't happen that frequently. The anthropogenic risks, on the other hand, one of the things that humans do that's different from the rest of nature is that we're really fast and we do things much more rapidly than other things happen in nature. Partly because we have culture and technology as opposed to just relying on biology. So anthropogenic risks include, of course, nuclear war, misaligned AI, nanotechnology, environmental toxicity, which is not one that people talk about a lot, but definitely the environment's becoming more toxic, and we need to, gradually we're spreading places around the world that are too toxic to live in. We need to make sure that doesn't get to be too much of a problem, or else we're going to have to deal with it. Extreme climate change. The climate change we're experiencing right now is bad, but I'm talking about very sudden leaps in climate change, which have happened in the past of Earth. And then, of course, engineered pandemics could be another problem, although it's not as bad as you would think, just because it really depends on the disease itself, or whether there are multiple of these diseases going around at once. One that I don't have on there is that I just wrote a book called Space Ethics, which you can see on my shelf up there. But in that book, one of the things I talk about is we're getting the ability to direct asteroids, for example, not only to deflect them away from the Earth, but at some point people could choose to direct them towards the Earth if they wanted to do something really terrible. So there are all sorts of other risks out there too. Next slide, please. All right, so Christianity and Xrisk. This is where I think this theological intersection is an interesting one to me. So we know from our faith that God is a path for history, culminating with the completion or the end of the world. God also has a role in history based on the prime example of the advent of Jesus coming into the world and doing things that are genuinely new in universal history. So it might seem like Christians shouldn't worry about our survival because God has a plan and God is in charge. Next slide, please. However, these are the three things that make me think that we still need to be concerned about these sorts of questions. God has given humanity freedom, including the freedom to sin grievously. Biblical and non-biblical history agree that humans can cause immense evil. And so we have the historical and biblical examples of that. And past human-like species have gone extinct. So I'll just go into each of those in a little bit more depth. Next slide, please. So we have freedom, and that means that we can both do wonderful things and horrible things. God has permitted many kinds of evil, including genocide of millions of people. Humankind has not shown that there are any limits to our capacity for evil. Our humankind, we haven't shown that we have any limits to the horrible things we can do, and God has not shown that there are any limits on what God will prevent happening. Although we cannot know what we have been saved from, and it's possibly quite a bit. This is one of those things where people talk about ethics and they say, oh, what value does ethics have? And we have to say questions like, well, maybe ethics prevented something really bad from happening and you don't know about it because somebody made right decisions. It's very obvious when things go wrong, ethically speaking. It's not so obvious when things go right because you don't know the very big things that you've missed. And so I don't want to discount the role that divine providence may play here. Next slide, please. So if X risks are a real threat, does this impugn God's character? And I would say no, because our salvation is not of this earth. The evil that happens here and now will be corrected in the new heavens and the new earth. And we have to remember that Jesus was executed. That's the ultimate crime, right? Killing God, deicide, is the ultimate crime. God let humans do that. Although, guess what? We failed at it because you can't actually kill being itself. It doesn't make sense. So this, I think, is an interesting theological question. Next slide, please. So when I look at that, I say to myself, if God permits deicide, God also could likely permit human extinction, although we might fail at it, right? It might only turn into a global catastrophic risk or a global catastrophic catastrophe rather than an extinction level catastrophe. And of course, salvation is still possible. That's the ultimate thing that Christians are thinking about, not just things in this material temporal world. And I would say just as the resurrection was not exactly foreseeable, God could save humanity from an existential risk, although it might not be in this world in the way that we expect. Or, and this is where it becomes an effective altruism question, God could save us through our effort. And I know if you're coming from a Protestant background, you'll say, hey, wait a minute, what about works salvation? We don't talk about that. If you come at it from, other Christian perspectives, you can, if works are a more important part of the faith that you come from, then it maybe makes a little bit more sense. God works through people, though, and we can say maybe your salvation is not connected to that work that you're doing. However, that work could be very important for, actually making good things happen on earth, which I think is what effective altruism has captured. I think in a fundamental way, effective altruism takes a lot of Christian ideas and says, hey, let's make it bigger. And so in a lot of ways, effective altruism really does align with Christianity in many ways. Next slide, please. All right. So I want to put brackets around divine intervention. I think divine intervention is absolutely possible. It may have happened many times in the past that we don't know about. But what I would say is that it's our role as God's children and also God's friends to help fulfill God's mission to limit evil as much as we can, up to and including the worst evils, which includes, of course, mass destruction, mass death, global catastrophe, and possible human extinction. We know what God's mission is on Earth. It's not to ruin everything. It's to try to make things better. It's to love our neighbor and to love God. Those are the two commandments. And so we really need to think about how do we live those out. Next slide, please. So Pope Francis and Pope Benedict actually, they have a couple of great quotes from some encyclicals recently. So in Laudato Si, which came out in 2015, Laudato Si quotes Pope Benedict from Caritas in Veritate in 2009. And this is what Pope Francis says. He says, "The work of the church seeks not only to remind everyone of the duty to care for nature, but at the same time," and this is quoting Pope Benedict, "she must above all protect mankind from self-destruction." And this is one of those things that I look at and I say, wow, the popes are explicitly talking about this existential risk question. Not couched in that language, of course, but it's really obvious as human beings, we are contingent, we can cause terrible things to happen, and therefore we need to stop it. We need to do something about it. Next slide, please. All right, so moving on to the example of history. That's kind of, background. Now the example of history. History, of course, is brutal. Both biblical and non-biblical history are full of disasters. There's the story of Noah and the flood. If you take it literally, then humans are intentionally exterminated, except for a few people, and God permits a global catastrophe, but also offers a way out through technology. I think it's worth noting. However, I'm not saying you have to take it literally. If it's not taken literally, then it's a rationalization of rising sea levels after the Ice Age. This is something that almost every culture on Earth has. If they have a connection to the ocean and they've been able to see the sea level rise over time, then they have a flood story. Why is that? Because the sea levels rose hundreds of feet after the Ice Age. However, the sentiment is still there. In biblical religion, that extermination idea or near extermination is a possibility that we should keep in mind based on this story. Next slide, please. There's also a lot of violence in the Bible. There are lots of examples where entire groups of people are targeted for extermination or are exterminated. Not saying it's a good thing. I'm just saying it's mentioned in the Bible as an option. So in that way, I think when we're thinking about the question with existential risk, that's really something that we need to keep in mind, which is that this is in the history, it's in our religious text. And of course, not to put all the violence in the past, the book of Revelation has violent imagery about the future as well. Of course, that depends on your interpretation of what Revelation actually means. Next slide, please. So another thing I would say is that we should keep in mind the fall of the Roman Empire. That should be something that's still lodged in our minds. Coming from a Catholic perspective as I do, that's something that I think the Catholic Church maybe keeps in mind a little bit more than some of the newer forms of Christianity. The Catholic Church has undergone a civilizational collapse. It's witnessed that happen. It happened 16 centuries ago, but we need to keep that as a possibility. And the church did things, it learned things during that time, which were things like preserve textbooks, preserve knowledge, develop the institutions that you need in order to recover. And of course, if it happened before, then it could happen again. Life goes on, but chaos reigned for centuries. It's not a great outcome, really. Ultimately, good came from evil, civilization recovered, and so now we are here where we are. Next slide, please. All right, the Bible is not unusual, and ancient history is not unusual either. Once again, so many terrible things have happened through history, and we need to recognize that they can happen again. During the Cold War, if you want to just go back to the last century, there were numerous nuclear near misses. Some of the famous ones include Stanislav Petrov in 1983, the Cuban Missile Crisis back in the early 1960s included no fewer than 4 incidents where nuclear weapons were almost used. There were several places where, Vasily Arkhipov in the Russian submarine near Cuba is a prime example of this. There were two people who are in the command positions on the submarine said, let's use the nuclear weapons. And Vasily Arkhipov said, no, we don't know if a war's actually started yet, so we're not going to use them. There was apparently another submarine that was like this, and there were several incidents where lines were drawn by the U.S. administration. The generals said this, hey, if this happens, then we're going to start a nuclear war. And the times that those happened, President Kennedy said, no, even though we decided that yesterday, we're not going to do it. So really, and there are lots of other incidents too. And so here we are, we have to ask ourselves, so what's going on? Is this divine intervention? Is it just stupid luck? Maybe. If it is divine intervention, what I would say is that we shouldn't rely on it happening again. We should probably try to prevent getting ourselves into these terrible situations, because it's, in a sort of a way, it's putting God to the test, right? It's saying, hey, God, we're doing something really stupid, but we know you'll get us out of it. That's a bad strategy, right? The better strategy is, let's not get into this bad situation in the first place. Let's see what we can do to prevent these things from happening. Next slide, please. All right. Of course, if you look back at deep history, Earth has had lots of mass extinctions on it. Most species that have ever lived are now extinct. Extinction is actually much more common than being alive as a species. And multiple previous species of the genus Homo have gone extinct. For example, Neanderthals, Denisovans, and the Floresiensis species that lived on the island of Flores in Indonesia. They're also known as the hobbit species of humans. Next slide, please, because they were very short. All right, there's another way to go extinct, which is not just to have every one in your species die, it's also to transform into a different species. So this is where questions of transhumanism arise. Extinction by replacement is very common in evolutionary history as well. There are a lot of people out there who are working towards transhumanism. Most don't advocate exterminating the quote unquote mostly original substrate humans or moshes, but there are people who have talked about this before. One of my other research fields has been looking at transhumanism, and there are some bad people involved in the movement. I'll just put it that way. Next slide, please. Ultimately, long term, if you want to think hundreds of millions of years into the future, or billions of years, the sun is going to expand. It's going to overheat the Earth first. Somewhere between 500 and a billion years into the future are the statistics or the numbers that I've seen a few NASA people talk about. And then, eventually the Earth is going to get captured by the sun and engulfed and destroyed. That's not close, but it's going to happen based on the current knowledge that we can extrapolate into the future. Next slide, please. All right, so could God use an Xrisk? In which case, this is kind of new material. I didn't talk about this last time. Could God use an Xrisk to end the world? In which case, if we're opposing Xrisk, would we actually be opposing God? And I would say the answer is, of course, yes, God can do anything. But that doesn't change the fact that God can achieve God's ends, whether we are opposing God or not. And because we're actually following God's law of love, this should not oppose us to what God is doing. Fundamentally, God says love each other. That does not include horrible, horrible disasters. I suspect that you probably don't have too much trouble with that. Although it's interesting to play with the ideas, just because we're dealing with very difficult things here. By the way, does anybody recognize the scene, this movie scene? Anybody? This is from Terminator 2. This is the destruction of Los Angeles. All right, next slide, please. All right, and so what I would say is that Christianity is not an apocalyptic death cult. This is not something we're aiming for. The background image here is the Jonestown massacre, where 800 people died because of a crazy cult leader. God has not put us on earth to do bad things. God's put us here to do good things. And I think that one of the wonderful things about Christianity is that it provides this fundamentally altruistic vision of how we're supposed to relate to reality. We're supposed to help each other. We're supposed to make things better. We love God. We love our neighbor. There are certain small groups of Christians who are in these sort of culty type organizations who think that they're supposed to be trying to bring about the apocalypse or things like that. They're fundamentally, that's not what Christianity is about. And once again, I don't think anyone here is probably going to debate these questions, but I think it's worth being explicit about it, because the cultural image of Christianity is sometimes that it's the lunatics who are the normal people, right? I learned a word for that yesterday. We all know the word cherry picking data, right? You cherry pick, you pick the data that meets what you're doing. This person said, on the internet, what people do is nut picking. They find someone who's a nut and they pick them out and they say, this person's crazy. And therefore everyone who's in their group is also crazy, just like they are. But we have to remember that's not the right way to run reality. If you want to, cause bad relations between people and fundamentally set up dynamics, intergroup dynamics where people are competing and trying to harm each other, ideologically speaking, then you do things like that. That's not something Christians should be doing. So on the contrary, we should fight against secular apocalypse with all our strength. The day and the hour, that's God's to know. Our job is fundamentally to love each other. Next slide, please. All right, so just a summary of part 2. Existential risks are conceptually real and theologically possible. I can't make an airtight case that God would allow or not allow a secular apocalypse, or that Christian effort could stop a secular apocalypse. A secular apocalypse, of course, being an existential risk that doesn't involve God's intervention or involvement. What I can say definitively is that we should try to mitigate and adapt against these sort of risks. Mitigation means you reduce the risk. Adaptation means that with the risk that's left after mitigation, you try to survive the risk that you're exposed to. And so the last thing I would say is that the likelihood that we should care is 100%. That's absolutely certain. Next slide, please. All right, so what do we do about it? It's our duty to love our neighbor and care for each other. So we should protect each other from harm, whether or not X risks are a real threat. If God is protecting us against X risks, then working against them will still bring temporal and eternal benefits, short of preventing the X risk itself. That would be my fundamental assertion here. Next slide, please. All right, our command is to love. As I've said multiple times, as followers of Christ, that's our command. That means we need to want the best for people. Human extinction, obviously, is not in people's best interest. And things far short of extinction are still quite bad, and we should try to avoid those as well. Next slide, please. So what are best interests when we think about that? The ultimate good is eternal life with God in heaven. Temporal goods are lower and subordinate to that ultimate good. However, God explicitly says to love your neighbor. And then, of course, in Matthew 25, I was hungry and you gave me food. I was thirsty and you gave me drink. As you did this to the least of my brethren, you did this to me. And so we need to be thinking about other human beings out there as being literal images of God, right? We need to be thinking about this big picture of trying to help everybody in the world, which is, once again, why I think that effective altruism and Christianity align very well. Next slide, please. So extinction ruins God's plans, I think is the way I would describe it, right? We can't do all these good things if there's nobody around to do good things for. We're commanded to love as God has loved everyone, no matter what, even our enemies. We should serve the needy as we should serve Jesus himself. And death and extinction ruin those things. Therefore, we have to oppose existential risks and global catastrophic risks. Next slide, please. So allowing extinction would be the ultimate dereliction of the duty to love. It would likely also destroy much of Earth's biosphere. Very often not very often, occasionally when I talk about these things, someone with a more environmental perspective will say, oh, that's good. If there are no humans around, then the environment will recover and those sorts of things. And I say to myself, you recognize that if you kill every single person on Earth, you're going to kill other things too, right? This is not you can be highly specific probably in terms of these things. Maybe you can do something extremely precisely horrible, but very likely if it's something like nuclear war, you're going to be polluting the environment and killing billions of other animals too. So Xrisk should absolutely be avoided, and avoiding them will bring benefits, even if God would have otherwise protected humankind. Next slide, please. So what I would say is defend against the worst, and in the process, you'll probably avoid a lot of other bad outcomes too. So for example, global nuclear arms control could probably help prevent regional nuclear war, which of course would itself be a terrible disaster. Attempts to prevent the emergence of Xrisk level malicious AI, for example, will likely prevent other less dramatic AI mishaps too. Next slide, please. So what should we do? You're doing it right now. You're becoming aware, you're becoming motivated, educated. Then the question, of course, is to find your role. Is this something that you find to be highly motivating? Is this something that you want to work on? Or maybe you just, talk to people about it, raise awareness for others. Think of that as a form of evangelism, right? Joining or supporting organizations opposing existential risks, helping the poor. I mean, helping the poor in basic developmental things are likely to be helpful in the big picture also. Then, of course, get active. Once you figure out what you want to do, then get active. Next slide, please. So I'm a technology ethicist. I think that technology plays a critical role, not only in creating X risks, but in protecting against them as well. And here I'm going to get a little bit theological again. God is being itself. Humanity is contingent, though. God is perfectly good, perfectly powerful, and perfectly existent. In other words, God is the ground of existence. Humans are none of those things, which means that we can use our power for evil and for self-destruction. Next slide, please. So here's a joke. And this joke goes at least back to the 1920s, but there have been various versions of it that have come out in the time since then. So time is what keeps everything from happening all at once, and space is what keeps everything from happening to you. And this is a interesting kind of physics question in terms of space and time. And then it becomes theological if you think about it in terms of God. For God, all space and time are here and now. So everything is, here and now. It's a very different perspective on reality. It's very, very mind-bending to think about. Humans, obviously, is not the case. But we're working to reduce those barriers that space and time have placed upon us. You can think of these as either a feature or a bug in the way that reality is set up, right? The feature is that if we're less powerful, then we're less capable of doing terrible things. But of course, we can't do good things also. So I think that fundamentally what we need to be thinking about with time and technology progressing is that we need to be thinking about fundamentally an ethical perspective on technology first before the technology itself. Technology gives you power, but ethics is what tells you what to do with that power. And as we're becoming more powerful through space and time, this makes us more dangerous to ourselves. Next slide, please. So, and these, I just have a few slides here with quotes that I like to say over and over again. In the past, we were involuntarily constrained by our weakness, but now we need to learn to be voluntarily constrained by our ethics. We have to learn to use technology to make good easier and evil more difficult, or we're going to create a terrible world to live in. So it's fundamentally what technology is about. Technology is power, and we need to make sure that we're using it for good and not for evil. Otherwise, we're going to, live with the consequences of our actions. Next slide, please. So technological power gives us freedom and new choices, greater scope of action, greater efficiency, greater determinacy of outcome. And if we have new choices, then we need ethical deliberation to tell us which among those choices are good and which are bad. Next slide, please. So how can we use technology to make good more effective, efficient, and probable? How can we use technology to make evil less effective, less efficient, and less probable? I think this is kind of the fundamental question of technology, right? Technology, we can use technology to make good easier, and we can use technology to make evil easier, but we do not want to do the second. We want to make sure that we're making evil much more difficult as we can make it. And at the same time, we're recognizing that so many technologies are dual use, and there are these power dynamics and competitive dynamics in the international system. There are a lot of moving parts and things to think about, but we have to actually do the work. Thank you. Next slide. So this is the conclusion. Then I'd love to see some questions. So if God is protecting us against existential risk, then working against these risks will align us with God and still bring temporal and eternal benefits short of preventing the risk itself. And of course, our duty to love should scale with humanity, I would say. We should try to see the world as God sees it, with billions of people to love, care for, and protect now and in the future. Next slide, please. So thank you very much. Feel free to email me or go to the Markkula Center website and see some of the things that we're doing there. Only a small bit of the Markkula Center's work focuses on existential risk. It's basically the work that I do, but the Markkula Center has a lot of other ethics resources too in a lot of different areas. All right, I'd love some questions.